So I want to just do one from the Old Testament. And there are 68 of these in the Old Testament. We're just going to do one. 68 from one book I'll tell you about here in a few minutes. But this is the most intriguing one that I found from the Old Testament. All right? Why did David's trusted counselor become so cruel to David? Who was David's trusted counselor, and why did he become cruel to David? What are we talking about here? Well, Ahithophel is a long-time and respected advisor to David. So much so that in 2 Samuel 16, it says, "Now in those days the advice of Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God." That was how both David and Absalom, David's son, regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. It was like talking to God. They thought this guy was the top advisor they had, or one of the top advisors they had, and so this guy was very, very well respected. But then something goes wrong. What goes wrong? First of all, has anyone ever heard of Ahithophel? I've never heard of him. Never heard of him until I started reading this stuff. Who is Ahithophel? Well, let's find out who he is. Well, before we do, we got to figure out what went wrong. Absalom rebels against his father's rule and sends for Ahithophel. Who's Absalom? Anyone know? One of David's sons. Now, David had many wives and concubines. That's just what they did back then. It was not approved of by God. In fact, that's one thing you always have to remember when the skeptics say, well, the Bible had polygamy and concubines. Does that mean God approved it? The Bible records a lot of things God didn't like. That's one of the reasons we know it. They're telling the truth. They're not trying to hide any of their sins. They're just admitting it, as embarrassing as it is. In fact, God says don't multiply wives in Deuteronomy 17:17. It's against God's will, but they did it. And whenever they did it, what happened to them? Disaster. Here's an instance of it. Absalom rebels against his father's rules. Anyone know why Absalom's mad at dad? He's a teenager. No, everybody's mad at dad when they're a teenager. What's the problem? Anyone know?
His sister was raped by his brother.
Tamar is raped by his brother, her brother. And they're kind of half-brothers and sisters, and his dad didn't do anything about it. And so Absalom wants to avenge Tamar's rape, and maybe among other things too. So he decides he's actually going to rebel against his father. Never happened, right? Okay. Happens all the time. Here's what happens. While Absalom was offering sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, to come from Gilo, his hometown. And so the conspiracy gained strength, and Absalom's following kept on increasing. Wait a minute. This guy is a trusted advisor to the king, and when the king's son decides he's going to rebel against the king's son calls David's trusted advisor and says, come help me, and the guy goes? Why? Why would he do such a thing? That's crazy. Well, here's what happens next. David flees Jerusalem because Absalom's coming. And he thinks Absalom's going to try and take him out. So he flees Jerusalem and he prays against Ahithophel. David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. How many have been to Jerusalem? You ever been there? You know, right outside of Jerusalem is the Kidron Valley to the east, and then you go up this hill where all those graves are now. That's the Mount of Olives. David's heading out of town weeping. His head was covered and he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads too and were weeping as they went up. Now David had been told, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. So David prayed, Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. And if you keep reading the account of this, it's very interesting. I mean, this should be a movie. Someone already made it a movie somewhere, I'm sure. But as David's leaving town, one of the Israelites is cursing at him and throwing stuff at him. And some of the guards of David said, you want us to take this guy out? And David says something like, no, leave him. I deserve this. Maybe the Lord sent this guy to punish me. Maybe the Lord told him to throw rocks at me. Leave him. So he's dejected, heading out of town. His own son is coming to take over his throne. Now, Absalom enters Jerusalem and asks for Ahithophel's advice. Here's what happens. Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give us your advice. What should we do?" Ahithophel answered, "Lie with your father's concubines whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench in your father's nostrils, and the hands of everyone with you will be strengthened." All I can say is, what? What? So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he lay with his father's concubines in the sight of all of Israel. What? How did this guy go so bad? Does he have some sort of vendetta against David? He's been his trusted advisor for so long. And then why is he telling him to do his own son to sleep with David's concubines in the full sight of everyone? Anyone know where we're going with this? Puzzle piece number 1. Let's take a look at that. I'm still asking the question, why did this guy do this? Here's puzzle piece number 1. Who was Ahithophel? We got to figure out who this guy was first, right? If you go to 2 Samuel 23, so this is like 8 chapters later in 2 Samuel, there's just a list of who was a bodyguard for David. Among the 30 of David's bodyguards were Eliam, son of Ahithophel, the Gilonite, and Uriah the Hittite. Does anyone recognize this name? Who's Uriah the Hittite? Uriah the Hittite is the husband of Bathsheba. All right, keep that in mind. So, but this guy, Eliam, is the son of Ahithophel the Gilonite. So the son of Ahithophel and Uriah must know one another. They're in a small group of 30 bodyguards. They know one another. Keep that in mind. Okay. Next puzzle piece. Who was this guy, Eliam, son of Ahithophel? One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a beautiful woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Can anyone see the connection yet? Yeah. What's the connection? Who is Ahithophel?
Father-in-law.
Huh?
He was the grandfather.
Of?
Ahithophel is the grandfather of Bathsheba. Do you see why Ahithophel is annoyed with David and has a vendetta against David? Check this out. Let's take a look at the bloodline here. Here's Ahithophel, here's Eliam, and here's Bathsheba. David, his son Absalom. Ahithophel is the trusted counselor of David. His son Eliam is a bodyguard for David. And so is Uriah the Hittite. Well, Uriah and Eliam must be friends. Eliam says, "I have a beautiful daughter. Maybe you should meet." So they do. And Uriah becomes wedded to Bathsheba. David sees Bathsheba on the roof. And what then does he do to Uriah? He sends him into battle. Not just does he send him into battle, he tells the others, "You push him ahead, so he'll surely die." And you know the story? He first sends for Uriah. His first plan is to send for Uriah and have Uriah lay with Bathsheba, so the baby conceived as a result of David and Bathsheba, Uriah will think it's his baby. That's his first solution. But when Uriah comes home and David says, "Why don't you go in and sleep with your wife?" what does Uriah say? He won't do it. Why won't he do it? Yes, how can I be in here with my wife when my brethren are fighting in the war? That wouldn't be right. That wouldn't be fair. So David couldn't get this honorable man to go in and lie with his wife. So plan B, kill him. David takes out Uriah. David just took out Ahithophel's grandson-in-law. Just took him out. Now, I don't know if Bathsheba has any kids at this point, but Grandpa's in here. If somebody messes with your granddaughter's husband like this, you're not going to be happy about it, are you? So, Ahithophel is thinking, when am I going to have a chance to get back at David? Well, what happens is, as soon as Absalom rebels, Absalom knows this, he says to Ahithophel, why don't you come with me? So he does, but David outsmarts him. What does David do? David sends in a double agent, Hushai. Hushai goes down to Absalom and makes Absalom believe he's with Absalom, but in reality he's working for David. And instead of taking Ahithophel's advice, Absalom takes Hushai's advice, and Ahithophel at that point knows that it's going to be disaster for Absalom. And now he's left out in the cold, because once Absalom's either deposed or killed, David's going to say, why did you do this? So what does Ahithophel do? The text says he got his affairs in order and killed himself. But now go back. Why do you think he said to Absalom, sleep with your father's concubines on the roof? On the roof. On the roof. Same thing David did with Bathsheba. At least he saw her on the roof. You see the connection now? Now, you got to be some sort of super detective. I didn't come up with all this. J.J. Blunt came up with it. I mean, to see all these interconnections, I mean, these are just minor references somewhere else in the scriptures. You wouldn't see all these connections. In fact, how many of these so-called undesigned coincidences or elaborate testimonies are there? This man is J.J. Blunt, or this is his book. Again, the book's written 150 years ago. The title was Undesigned Coincidences in the Writings, both of the Old and New Testament, an argument for the veracity, with an appendix containing undesigned coincidences between the Gospels, Acts, and Josephus. So this guy's writing 150 years ago, and here's what he includes in this book. He has 68 of these things, like Ahithophel and David from the Old Testament. He has 43 between the Gospels and Acts. That's just the Gospels and Acts. That's nothing to do with the epistles or anything else, just Gospels and Acts. And he has 22 interlocking puzzle pieces between the Gospels and Acts and Josephus. He doesn't have anything about Tacitus or Suetonius or any of these other things. Now, you can download this book for free on the internet if you want to, because the copyright's over with.